good afternoon, good morning for at least two of you, I think, who are in the US. Thank you very much for being here. And I'm going to just to give some indications about how the webinar is going to happen, and then I will introduce the three of you, and then we'll start with your presentations. I think you are all now able to share your screens. If you are not, just let me know, and I will do my best to help you share your screens. So, hi everyone, welcome to our webinar about the MPA Guide, a very much expected webinar. We had a lot of people asking us for webinar about this paper, and we are very happy to have you here. This webinar is part of Siena's initiative that has been taking place for quite some time now, at least a year and a half probably since COVID started, and this is going to happen exactly the same way that the other webinars have happened, which we'll have a presentation from all the three of our authors, 10-15 minutes each. I would advise you to make it 10 because we usually have a lot of questions, and we really want to let everyone express themselves. And then after these presentations, we are going to have a Q&A session where people from the audience will be able to drop their questions in the Q&A box we have in the bottom of our screens. I will also advise you not to leave your questions, audience, in the chat box because we may lose some of the questions. Me and Nick are going to make our best not to lose those questions, but please try to put them on the Q&A box, and they will appear in our screens. What we'll do after is that me and Nick are going to read these questions because the audience cannot read them, only us and the speakers can read them. So we are going to read them out loud, and then we will proceed with the answers and the debate. Something I also need to say is that we are being recorded. We usually release these videos on our YouTube channel for all of the people that registered and couldn't make it, or people that didn't register but want to see the webinar. I don't think I am forgetting anything. Nick, am I? Maybe I am.
No, all good on my side. Just introducing ourselves.
Yeah, that's also important.
Yeah.
So I am Anna. I'm Fisheries Policy Officer at Siena, and with me is Nicola, who is also a Fisheries Policy Officer in Siena, and we are very happy to be here with you. And then let me proceed by introducing our three guest speakers. So first we have Dr. Kirsten Grorud-Colvert, and she is a marine ecologist and associate professor, senior research at Oregon State University, which is why you are in the US and it's really early for you. So thank you for being here. And she's working at the intersection of ocean science and biodiversity conservation for human well-being. Dr. Kirsten also leads a team of ocean scientists and students whose mission is to share science with the wider world, help to sustain species, and to be in service of society. After we have Dr. Jenna Sullivan-Stack, I think this is the way to say it, and Dr. Jenna is an ecologist and conservation scientist with training in marine community ecology and a passion for finding science-driven solutions to threats facing our oceans. She's also currently, I think, in the US and is a postdoctoral scholar at the same university as Dr. Kirsten, with whom she works on the MPA project. Last but not least, we have also Dr. Bárbara Horta Costa. She's a Portuguese postdoc researcher from the Algarve Center of Marine Sciences. We usually know it as CCMAR from the University of Algarve, and she is working in marine conservation and management. She's particularly interested in marine protected areas and their effects in marine communities, but also in local users such as artisanal fishers. Recently, these three researchers with several other researchers from around the world published a groundbreaking paper called the MPA Guide, a framework to achieve global goals for the ocean, which is the name of our webinar as well. We are going to discuss this paper, and I'm going to share the paper here with all of you in the audience here in the chat box, so that you can check it online. I'm pretty sure that most of our attendants have already read it, but still I'm going to share it. So with no more delays, I can ask Dr. Kirsten, can you share your screen? I think you can.
Great, yes, let me do that here.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. It's working.
All right, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Nick and Alessandra, for having us today. We're thrilled to be here. And just want to say that I'll be speaking, of course, along with my esteemed colleagues and close friends, Jenna and Barbara, but also we're here on behalf of many other people. As Anna mentioned, our science paper was published last month, and we have 42 co-authors on this paper. So there's many of us. This is truly a global effort. Beyond that, those 42 named scientists, policy experts, management experts, we had a number of people around the world in this community who were expert reviewers of earlier versions of the MPA guide, collaborators on the initial brainstorming about what we really could use in the marine community to help us have a clearer way of speaking about marine protected areas. And so truly this was a very big collaboration, and we're happy to be here on behalf of all those folks. I also want to mention that we have these founding partners that you see listed on the bottom. This is a joint partnership between the UN Environment Program and the World Conservation Monitoring Center, IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, National Geographic's Pristine Seas Program, our MPA project at Oregon State University, Protected Planet, which is the annual reporting from the World Database on Protected Areas, and also the Marine Conservation Institute's Marine Protection Atlas. You might know it as mpaatlas.org. So happy to be here with you today. I just wanted to set the scene because I think we have a lot to talk about, but to start off with the reality that ocean systems are on the edge in all of our various corners of the world. I would bet that we've seen change in the ocean systems that we interact with and that we rely on for a lot of different things. Whether it's pollution or habitat degradation, changes in fish stocks over time, ocean systems are on the edge. We know that MPAs are one of the solutions, one of the best solutions, really. They're not the only solution. We don't have time today to get into all the different tools and pieces that are needed for effective ocean conservation and management, but MPAs are one of the best tools because when we're thinking about setting aside areas of the ocean for specific conservation or use, marine protected areas are widely used around the globe. They are also widely studied by scientists and have been for decades. So we have quite a lot that we can say about MPAs, and that was really the beginning of this process with that knowledge. The other important part about MPAs is that they play a role in international and regional and national targets for ocean protection. We have the negotiations happening right now in the Convention on Biological Diversity. What will the new global biodiversity framework look like? Will we have a new number of percent ocean to protect? And so we're very focused on numbers, but also just the reality that we need to be focused on quality as well. There are many different types of MPAs. And so that's why we developed the MPA guide to help support these discussions. So because MPAs are so widely used and an important tool, they're in discussions all over the world, but still some areas of confusion remain. And these are kind of the three focal areas that we move forward with. First of all, we need to know what the protected in MPA means. There are many different types of MPAs with many different types of uses that are allowed or not allowed. All of those have impacts on what the MPA can accomplish. We need to know when to count an MPA as protected. You may have heard the term paper parks, which is kind of a shorthand way of saying that there are marine protected areas or terrestrial protected areas out there that are on paper, but perhaps not accomplishing what they are intended to in the water. And then we also need to align our targets, these percentages, these numbers, and the MPAs with the outcomes that we want for nature and people. And this gets to this quality aspect, not only quantity, but also quality of these areas. So we endeavored to answer these questions through an inclusive, collaborative, and consultative process that was about 3 years formally, but truly probably a decade in the making. We evaluated the state of the science and local knowledge about MPAs, and here's where that global collaboration comes into play that I was speaking about before. We consulted with managers, scientists, policy experts, local knowledge holders, and basically took stock of what we know about MPAs and what they can do, what they can't do, and how we can move forward with them effectively. So here's where we landed. The MPA guide has 4 different components to it. It describes the levels of protection of any given MPA, the stages of establishment, the enabling conditions that are the social or ecological conditions needed for an MPA to be successful, and the social and ecological outcomes. And this is really where the investment is, right? In the different outcomes for nature and for people that we want to see from the investments that are put into MPAs. So let's go back to that question about what the protected in MPA means. This is why we developed the levels of protection, which essentially take our knowledge about MPAs globally and distill them into these 4 different levels that are based on the types of activities that are allowed or not allowed in any given MPA. So these range from minimally protected, where, for example, in many MPAs around the world, there are still significant sources of extraction that take place. But importantly, these always point back to the definition of an MPA, which is, by IUCN's definition, a place in the ocean where the primary goal is the conservation of nature. So as we move forward, we might have lightly protected or even highly protected places where these different activities may be less extractive or destructive, and then finally fully protected. So you might think about terms that we used to use like marine reserve in the US, or marine park in a place like Chile. These are areas where no extractive or destructive activities are allowed and all impacts are minimized to the extent possible. So really, what the protected in MPA means when you follow the guide is that protection for biodiversity, again, the primary goal of an MPA by definition, means protection from environmentally damaging activities. For example, industrial fishing by IUCN's recent resolution is incompatible with the conservation of nature. So you wouldn't expect an MPA that allows this activity to have biodiversity outcomes. And then on the spectrum, we look at the different types of activities and what their impact might be. And Jenna and Bárbara will be speaking more about that. So when do we count an MPA as protected? And here we look to the stages of establishment of an MPA. So this is that second key area of the MPA guide. And these range from proposed and committed, where a country or another entity sets forth formally their intention to create an MPA. But of course, nothing is official yet. Designated is when it's established through legal or other traditional means so that the rules and regulations could be enforced, but implemented is when they are actually active on the water. So this is the point where biodiversity conservation and its outcomes can really start to accrue, but not before. And then finally, active management is what all MPAs are moving towards, with monitoring and engagement and continual evaluation. So when do we count an MPA as protected? An MPA can achieve its goals only when it is implemented in the water with protections in place and active. So now we can use that terminology. Designated is certainly a step forward with something being legal, but until it's active and implemented in the water, that's when we can count it as contributing to biodiversity conservation. So how can we align our targets and our MPAs with the outcomes that we want for nature and people? And here the enabling conditions of the guide factor in strongly. So these are all the different social, ecological settings that are really needed for an MPA to be successful. So for example, partnership with local communities, rights holders and stakeholders, inclusive, equitable, and evidence-based decision-making that's based on ecological design, effective size and spacing, for example, and long-term financial support, political commitment, monitoring. All these are needed to inform adaptive management to make sure that an MPA is actually achieving the goals that we want it to, especially since a lot of investments are put into MPAs globally. And then these ideas of collaboration, transparency, communication, accountability, all things that may not always be explicitly discussed when we're talking about MPAs, but are really key to ensuring that it is effective over the long term. So if we want to align our targets with outcomes that are for nature and people, we need to ensure that MPAs are equitable, that they're just, that they're ecologically designed, and that they share the benefits with local communities. And amid our 42 co-authors, we have a number of social scientists and leaders in this space who are continuing to work on how to track these effectively in MPAs. So when we're talking about our targets, we do end up talking about numbers, and the MPA guide provides a way for us to look more closely at what a single target, for example, a symbol percentage may have underneath it. So here we're taking two of those axes of the MPA guide, the level of protection and the stage of establishment. And really what we can do now is take each of these boxes here and find a number that corresponds to what this means worldwide. So for example, we may have a number of fully protected areas that are designated. So they would be kind of at the top middle, but we need to move those towards implemented, for example, if we want conservation outcomes to occur. So essentially what this means is that in that upper right-hand section of the matrix, these fully protected and highly protected areas that are implemented and actively managed are those that are going to achieve the greatest conservation outcomes. So fully protected, of course, because no extractive or destructive activities are allowed, but also highly protected. These are areas where human use, human extraction even is permitted, but these are areas where, for example, the sustainable use has happened for so long and it's such a small level with such low impact that we wouldn't expect to have great impacts on biodiversity. So for example, indigenous areas, areas that have been locally managed and sustainably managed for generations. So really what we're trying to work with is these ideas. What will the possible future hold? And depending on the level of protection, we know that we could have different possible futures. In the past, of course, most of the ocean acted as an MPA because we were limited by how far we could go to fish, how much we could fish, how deep we could fish. And so now technology and all the other things that have enabled widespread use of the ocean have changed that picture. So when we move forward, these decisions will have a really big impact on what the ocean looks like into the future. I want to close by saying that we know that if enabling conditions are in place, fully and highly protected MPAs have a number of different types of outcomes. And again, this is from the decades of scientific information, some of which the three of us have conducted and compiled, but most importantly, this is the state of the science across the entire scientific community and what we've been learning about these areas over the decades. We know that these areas are most effective at protecting biodiversity. They can enhance fisheries in adjacent areas because when you have a buildup of species inside an area, they tend to spill over into outside fished areas. They can also protect ecological balance and buffer against mistakes and uncertainty. These are kind of investment accounts to set aside for the future, especially because our future is in some ways unknown as our ocean is changing. They can provide reference areas, protect culturally important species and activities, protect carbon stores, and also, as a result, enhance climate resilience. So this can all be part of the factoring when MPAs are discussed, new MPAs are planned, MPAs are adopted, and targets are set. So if we want to align our targets and MPAs with the outcomes we want for nature and people, we also need to ensure MPAs have high levels of protection to conserve that biodiversity and bring its benefits to people. So we've hit a number of key points here. This is just in summary of what we've spoke about just now. Now I want to turn it over to Jenna and Bárbara, who are going to talk about how the MPA guide can be used in more detail and some examples from Portugal.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, and thanks so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I interrupted the screen sharing. I know.
It's okay, I can share my screen now.
Oh, okay,
and
I'm
start.
sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, it's great. Does that look good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much to Kirsten for that great overview. And Kirsten has given us really good why and how of the MPA guide. And then now Bárbara and I are going to walk through some of the details and the what of what exactly the MPA guide provides. So as Kirsten said, we have these two axes, level of protection and stage of establishment. And these are really what, as long as enabling conditions are in place, what helps us understand what biodiversity outcomes we might expect out of MPAs. So they're really important for understanding, how to align our goals with what we actually get and expect to get out of MPAs. So I'm going to start first by walking us through the stage of establishment in just a little more detail than what Kirsten gave earlier. So the stages of establishment are really useful for understanding what is actually happening in the water. And just like in the way that if you say that you want to lose 25 pounds, you don't get to check that off your list. You actually have to put in the work to lose the 25 pounds. Thinking of that analogy for the stage proposed and committed, this stage is when the intent to create an MPA is announced, but nothing else has quite happened yet. And it's a really important stage to start. This is where the site has been identified. Conservation, as we know, in the definition of an MPA, conservation of nature is the primary objective. And it's announced in some formal manner, but that announcement doesn't have to be binding. So that's the first stage. It's a very important one, but then importantly, moving on to the next stage, we have designated. This is when an MPA is established or recognized through legal or traditional means, and it has defined boundaries so we know where in space it is in the ocean. There's legal gazetting or recognition equivalent to that, and it's established importantly for the long term, so we know that the protection will last. And it has clearly stated goals and the process to define uses. So this is where the MPA guide levels might be helpful, thinking of what your goals are and then matching it to a level of protection that can allow you to achieve those goals. The next stage is implemented. And this, like Kirsten said, is really when biodiversity outcomes can start to accrue. This is where you're actually putting in the work to lose the pounds. You could start to see the benefits. The MPA is in force in the water with plans for management activated. They have plans for regulating those extractive and destructive activities. There is a team of people, a management body that exists and is working. People around the site know that the MPA is there and they need to comply with the regulations. And there's management plan activated. And the last one is actively managed. And in this is really the gold star for MPAs. This is where management of the area is ongoing. There's periodic review. They make changes as necessary to achieve conservation goals. So there's ongoing monitoring of biodiversity. engagement of communities, and evaluation of the management, so they can make changes to better achieve their goals as needed. Oop. And I actually am going to pass it over to Bárbara next to talk about the level of protection. Oops. Stop share. Over to you, Bárbara.
Can you share it, Bárbara?
I can share it too, if that's better.
Okay.
Share.
Bárbara is sharing now.
Okay.
I need to display this.
Yeah.
So do you see? Okay. And
Yes.
this is not. Yes. You see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So now regarding the other axis, the level of protection of the MPA guides, we have a series of activities that we consider, and we need to follow a decision tree and select paths that are going to lead us to a final protection level. And those paths are selected according to the activities that are allowed in a given MPA or zone. And so we need to start in the beginning and go through the decision tree. So the first activity that we need to consider is if mining, mineral, oil, or gas are allowed inside the MPA or zone. And if yes, it's easy to decide because it's incompatible with conservation. Then the second question is related with dredging and dumping, and a similar approach was followed. But here you are allowed to have very infrequent and for very selected purposes, like shoreline protection or safety or navigation. And in that case, you'll be moving to a lightly protected area. Then the third activity you need to know is about anchoring, and this is more related to the scale and density of this activity than to a specific activity type. So in this case, an incompatible would be an area where large vessels repeatedly anchor, and minimal impact would be fully regulated, where you cannot be anchoring in sensitive habitats. And then you have in the middle, lightly and minimal. Then you need to know about infrastructures, and there are a lot, varied types of infrastructures, and there's a guidance on different types to select the option you need to move forward. So for small scale and very minimal impacts, there are some examples that could be moorings or lights or management facilities that are needed to manage the area. Large impacts would be some small harbors, and incompatible areas would be areas with large ports, for example. And then for highly or lightly protected, where you have low to moderate, you could have artificial reefs or some aquaculture that is not highly impacting, or other infrastructures related to this, like renewable energy and so on. Then you have the aquaculture, which is, again, this is all about scale and density and intensity of activities, but there are some guidance on some types that you can distinguish. And in aquaculture is about having small scale unfed or fed aquaculture. So to have a highly protected area, you'd need a small scale unfed, like shellfish or algae aquaculture. And then the others would be more large scale and fed aquaculture. Then we come to fishing, and in fishing we have two conditions to fulfill. So we would need to know the number of fishing gears that are allowed, and also the type of fishing gears. So there's a list of all the potential fishing gears, and the potential impact that they have in habitats and species. So you cannot have a very low number of fishing gears, but and with them being highly impacting. In that case, you'd move for lightly or minimally protected, because in highly protected, you could only have very selective and low impacting fishing gears like lines or traps. Then in lightly, you would have nets, for example, or small scale long lines. And then you'd have trawling or pursening or other that are not industrial, because if they are industrial, they would be the area would be incompatible to with conservation. And then we reach the seventh activity, which are the non-extractive recreational activities. And here it's more about the scale and density, although you also have some guidance on the types of fishing gears that would be compatible with these three levels, as these are not used to distinguish to minimally or incompatible. So these only distinguish the first three protection levels. So at the end of knowing all these activities in detail and following this decision tree, one can reach protection level of a given area or a zone, a given MPA or a zone. And therefore, with incompatible with conservation not being considered compatible with MPAs. So now I will only give a very brief overview of something that we have been doing in Portugal. So giving a Portuguese example. And we selected the Rábida Marine Park, which is a very important MPA close to Lisbon in mainland Portugal. And the first information is that the stage of establishment is is implemented with conditions. So there has been a very long process and efforts to reach this implementation stage. But some criteria needs to be improved, and so there is this highlights that some sufficient enforcement and resources are still lacking to be a fully implemented MPA. And this is something that the MPA guide allows us to have this information. It can inform what is needed to move forward and to improve the MPA. So this is important information to share with managers and decision makers. Regarding to levels of protection, this MPA has the four levels. So it's mainly the most part is highly protected, followed by minimally, due to a harbor that exists in the middle of the MPA. And then we also have lightly due to some fishing gears, and then the smallest part is fully. But if we consider fully and highly, we have a considerable amount of these protection levels. Okay, so then we applied this example to the whole MPAs in Portugal. So the 72 nationally designated MPAs. And we see in this matrix that Kirsten and Jenna also spoke, that most of our MPAs in area are designated and lightly protected, followed by designated and highly protected. So 99% of our MPAs in area are only designated in these two protection levels. Then we have a small proportion of implemented, both lightly and highly. And then again, very, very small, actively managed of these two protection levels as well. Regarding fully protection, we have residual percent cover, they're almost zero, and also again designated and implemented. And we also have a small proportion of implemented with minimally protection. So this is very important, because now we know that only 0.4% are in that part of the matrix that should count and is likely to deliver significant conservation benefits. this is something to highlight and to show and to share. But also we found that we are with a small improvement, not that small, but in these cases can be done. We can move these highly protected areas that are only designated to implemented if we follow all the criteria that is needed for this implemented stage, which is what we expect from MPAs, that they are implemented and changing something in the water. So we know that we can improve this area of the matrix only with these movements. And also we can, these lightly protected areas that are designated can be much better if they are implemented and hopefully deliver some conservation benefits as well, even being lightly protected. Or they can be better, or part of them can be better regulated and moved to highly protected and implemented. So this is information that we need to share to decision makers, governments, and even to the general public to understand what is the current situation in Portugal or other countries. This is only an example, and what can be done to improve and to make the MPAs better and working in the water. So that's something I would like to share with you. And now I will give the word to Jenna again.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just let you advance the slides for me, Barbara. Perfect. I think I might be on a lag. I'm still seeing the matrix slide, but it could be.
I think you are, yeah. I'm seeing.
Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So in sum, we've heard from Kirsten about the why and the how of the guide. Then you've heard some of the details of the stages and levels and how this might be put into practice. And the overarching goal of the whole project really is to have to clarify how much of the ocean is protected and what we still need. And this can be on many different levels, from local to regional to global. Barbara has highlighted some really clear and useful examples of how the guide can help highlight investments that might be made at a even individual MPA scale at Arabida National Park, or a regional scale or a national scale in Portugal. And also on the global scale, thinking of answering the question of how much of the ocean is effectively protected that will get us the outcomes that we need to address these crises that we're in, biodiversity and climate. So the MPA guide, we hope is a really useful tool for all of these different scales of decision making. So yeah, really connecting outcomes with MPA types is the main goal here. You could go to the next slide. I can share some resources. I'm assuming it's up. I think I'm still on a lag, but oh, here we go. We have a website, the MPA guide, or mpa-guide.protectedplanet.net. I can put that in the chat here in a minute. There's a lot of really useful resources, we hope, on that website. Videos explaining a decision tree to walk through the level of protection and the state of establishment, some examples of the outcomes that we might expect. So it's really what's presented in the scientific paper, but just in a little bit more easily usable format. And I can highlight on the side the resources tab, or Barbara can. And you can go there to find more information. Like when Barbara was walking through each of the activities that determine the level of protection, there's a lot more information in the expanded guidance for level of protection, which is there. It's a long document that really details, and actually multiple levels of detail, depending on what you need, what the different fishing gears are that might and the impacts that might determine if it's lightly protected or highly, for example. So if you're interested in actually putting an MPA into this framework, this is where you should go for resources. And I think that's it. Thank you so much for having us. And we have plenty of time for questions, it looks like. So we're really excited to hear what you guys want to talk about.
You did an incredible job in time management. I have to tell you this, because sometimes we have only one speaker and it takes all this time. So it was great. Let me just
Okay.
change the view here. Okay, I think you can stop sharing. I will play. Let me copy and paste this link to everyone, and then I can put it here. So thank you a lot for your presentation. It was incredibly clear, and we already have a few questions here. I would once again encourage everyone to leave the questions here in the Q&A box, and I think we are able to start our discussion now. So the first question we have is from Catarina Abril. Hi, Katerina. And she's saying, hi, Bárbara, Kirsten, and Jenna. Great presentation. I was wondering, for the fishing impacts in the decision tree, is it only intentional fishing or is bycatch accounted for? I don't know who wants to take a go at this one.
I think I can answer.
Sure.
Yes. So the potential impacts were take into account the selectivity in species, in size, and also the impact in the bottom. So in the selectivity of species, you consider the bycatch. Yes. The potential, of course. This is.
Okay, thanks, Bárbara. I'm going to follow up. We'll do a question each between Ana and me.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is from Raquel. Thank you, Raquel. It's in Portuguese, but I'll take the liberty of translating it. And I think it's related to the part that Bárbara was presenting, related to the Arrábida Park.
Mm-hmm.
And Raquel says, good afternoon. My question is regarding the example of Arrábida, where it indicates that a single MPA can have more than one level of protection, and whether this is the case. I see nods, so please go for it.
Thanks so much for that question. That's definitely the case, because the level of protection we have, based on all of the great science that people have done over the decades, we have a really clear link between level of protection and the outcomes that can be expected. So for that reason, understanding different zones within an MPA, and if one zone is minimally protected and one zone is fully protected, the MPA guide treats each zone differently so that you can think about clearly what outcomes can be expected out of each of those zones. And often having a fully protected zone paired with a lightly protected, for example, can be really useful to allow that spillover Kirsten was talking about, where fish populations can replenish in the fully protected area and go into the areas around, which may be lightly protected, that allow some fishing gear. But yes, that's definitely the case.
Yeah, I would just add to that the World Database on Protected Areas also takes into account MPAs by zones, and does their tallying of how much is protected by keeping zones in mind. So the MPA guide is set up to work together with that, so that those types of information could also be brought into the World Database of Protected Areas.
Thank you. Could one of you put the link here, because I tried to type it and I missed it. Yeah, thank you, Jenna. So the next question is from, I'm going to take a risk here. I'm going to say it's Marinez, but I'm not sure if this is the case. And she's asking, is the temporal scale of the activities considered in the decision tree? For instance, if I have tourism activities only during summer, would the MPA still be considered lightly protected?
Yeah, so for us, kind of related to that first question, the idea of impact was really important to accommodate in this, because just looking at one place at one point in time doesn't give you the full picture of what's happening there. So when any manager or other person would be evaluating an MPA, they would think kind of across the range of activities that happen over the range of time in the MPA and assess their impact in that way. So for example, if something is non-extractive and only happens during one time of the year, then that impact would be very low. And so each person would keep that in mind when they're reporting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'll just keep going. We have a question from Enrique. Thank you, Enrique. So he says, many thanks to all speakers for the work presented. What do you think is lacking for governments to implement and actively manage MPAs? So easy question here.
Yeah, $1 million question here.
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, obviously, with no easy answer. Two things. First of all, what we hope with the MPA guide is that by bringing some of this into a framework and a common language, we can start to answer those questions by looking across, what's needed that the MPA guide identifies and what's there and what is missing and could still be there. Globally, I would say, there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it may be because a capacity is lacking. But my second point is that another thing that the guide can do is really highlight areas where investments are needed and could be connected with. It really helps celebrate the work that has already gone into so many of these MPAs. We all likely know that MPAs take time, they're an investment. I would say most, if not all of the time, when someone establishes an MPA, their goal is for it to be actively managed. So this helps kind of celebrate the investments that have already been made, but also provide, we hope, a helpful roadmap in moving forward.
And I would just,
I was just going to add that this was a discussion that took a long time and a lot of inputs and opinions. But the thing is that here you have in this expanded guidance that you can go, you have really the minimum criteria to move forward to the next stage of establishment and the best practices. And these are very important information because this will allow the government or decision makers to have some objective criteria to fulfill, to move to the next stage. So I think it's very useful for that. There's some guidance, even if it's not everything there, and you can always move a little bit for the right or left. There's very important guidance to move forward and to do those investments.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Let me say one more thing really fast. I know there's a lot of questions. One is that we three are ecological scientists, but there was a really strong team involved in the MPA guide that are social scientists. So I'm trying to channel, if they were here, their answer, which I guess one of the elements of the guide that we didn't spend as much time on today was enabling conditions, but not because it's not as important. So thinking of community engagement and communication and transparency and things like that. It's not officially, it's very related to stages of establishment, especially getting to that really, effective MPA actively managed, but also having the enabling conditions in place where communities understand and are able to lead and, rights holders and stakeholders are engaged. So just wanting to make sure we don't lose that piece here, that is, very important for getting to effective protection as well. And it's something that has been, those two conversations have been pretty disjointed. So it's another contribution of the guide. We're hoping is to bring those together and talk about both the social and ecological principles and design principles for an MPA that's successful, and also the outcomes that can be expected on for both people and for nature.
Thank you. Very, very, very complete answer. The next question we have is from Rita, and she's asking specifically for Bárbara. Rita is asking, does the Portuguese matrix slide the percentage of MPAs from 72 MPAs takes into account only the MPAs in mainland Portugal, or also includes data from the MPAs in the Azores?
Okay, so in mainland Portugal, we have very few MPAs that are nationally designated. We are not considering the Natura 2000 here because they don't have management plans yet. So we only consider those that are legally established by the Portuguese government. So to answer that, this includes all mainland and also Azores and Madeira.
Yeah, it's a really big number to not consider the Azores region. I just had a question, and we will, and this came into my mind as Bárbara was talking. So we had this this presentation from Bárbara talking about a bit about the Portuguese context, and it was surprising to me. I knew that it was a very high percentage of MPAs that were only implemented, but I didn't know it was 99%. So that's new information that I'm taking from here. Could Kirsten or maybe Jenna give us an overview of the US situation? Is it similar, or I can imagine?
Yeah, that's a timely question. I'm just in the process of starting to analyze, actually finishing analyzing the largest MPAs in the US. At least we have almost 1,000 MPAs, so there's a lot, and a lot of them are very, very small. And so I guess one thing is these assessments for now, like a bigger answer is the assessments for now from people like me sitting in Oregon for the entire United States. It's useful to get some of these initial numbers, but the goal in the long term is to have people, in the water or on the ground in specific areas be the ones inputting this information in, so that we can get really accurate understanding of impacts. In the US, a lot of MPAs are actively implemented and actively managed. The real concern, I think, is that most of our highly and fully protected area, almost all of our MPAs by area are in the remote Pacific, in two big marine national monuments in Hawaii and Pacific remote islands. And if you think of just the US mainland, there's not a lot of great protection here. So I think it's a little less on the stage of establishment. Maybe we'll highlight more on the level of protection and the coverage of different areas. Could be where the growth is in the US.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Jenna. So next question comes from Gonzalo. Thank you. I think this may overlap with the question that was asked before, but I'm sure you can expand on it a bit. So he says, thanks for the great paper and presentation. Have you presented the results /website/tool to decision makers? If so, what has been the reception, and what about from other stakeholders? Thanks.
Yeah, I could talk about the decision makers maybe to start. Yes, like I mentioned early on, this is a really important time for these types of conversations to be happening. And we began with that in mind, given that the CBD target is being negotiated right now. And there's a lot of conversation about the wording. Should it say strongly? Should it say fully? Should it say highly? Should it say 30%? Should it not? And so in the arenas where we have been able to do webinars at this point for decision makers, the feedback that we get is that it's really helpful to understand what's underneath some of these really key terms. Fully is thrown around a lot, highly is thrown around a lot, but to provide a system for actually pointing to what that means, and not only in terms of activities, but what the outcomes would be, has been incredibly valuable. And then also, I think just the idea of us all using that same language is super productive and helpful for decision makers. Like I mentioned earlier, we used to have different terms for these marine protected areas, and it got confusing very quickly because we all have our own contexts and our own national structures or local structures for naming MPAs. So the more we as a community can use those terms and point to the definitions of them, the better. Maybe Bárbara wants to talk about local level.
I'm working with Manuel Gonçalves here in Portugal, and we are reaching the managers now to have this information, to more accurate information. Some is already confirmed, and so we have been explaining and having the difficulties in proceeding and in classifying with them, and that I think is also very important because then they are more aware and they know this will be needed, and they are joining in and very interested in this. at the Portuguese level, yes.
Thank you, Bárbara and Kirsten. We have another question here, which it's not about marine protected areas. So let's see if you can tell us something about this. The question is from Rui, and he's asking if we apply this guide for in a general way, what is the main adjustments for terrestrial protected areas? Do you have any clue on this?
Oh, that's a great question. I think we all have something to say. Jenna, I saw you come off mute too. So we do all, yes, we have been thinking about this really carefully in conversations with colleagues at IUCN and other places. You know, of course, there's lots of, it says Marine Protected Area Guide right in the name. So it was developed with that science and our expertise in mind. But at its core, there's no reason that those 4 components of the guide couldn't be applied to terrestrial areas as well, particularly the stage of establishment, enabling conditions, the outcomes. The level of protection is a really interesting question, and that's what we're engaging with right now, because obviously you don't have fishing or those other activities, but you do have a range of different activities that are in most cases well-known, and likely their impact is well-known too. So that's kind of the next step. Another question is OECMs, but maybe one of the other authors will.
Yeah, Jenna?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So thinking through, how the framework itself can be useful, certainly with adjustments like Kirsten just said, and the question asker implied. For OECMs, the other effective area-based conservation measures, which are, in discussion for being counting towards any of these global targets, and so these are areas I'm sure most of you on this call know, but areas that aren't MPA, so maybe biodiversity protection isn't the main goal, but they do provide conservation benefit. Maybe they're exclusion areas around some other activity, like a military base or something that is the main goal isn't to protect biodiversity, but there's certainly plenty of opportunity for them to do so. So counting that conservation is really would be very useful, but making sure that it's effective, as it says in the name, is certainly the grand challenge. And we think that the MPA Guide framework can be equally useful there. We started with marine protected areas just because of the wealth of knowledge that we have on outcomes, because there's so many scientific studies that link fully protected areas especially, but MPAs in general directly to the outcomes. So there's probably a little work to do around that, and stage of establishment might be slightly different in an OECM that is usually actually established already. But so thinking through the details, but the framework we hope can be useful for protected areas generally, both in the ocean and on land, and also other conservation tools like OECMs.
I don't know if Bárbara wants to add anything. Did you have any contact from people working in land about this adjustments or this? I don't know.
That's really what we're engaging in right now. So with IUCN's partnership, our UNEP, WCMC, and IUCN founding partners live very much in that world, all protected areas, not just marine. So from the beginning, we've had that reporting and categorizing in mind, but now comes the work of actually figuring out what it looks like. And so there are some working groups upcoming that we're participating in through IUCN that will hopefully dive into some of those details. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. So next question comes from Ines Souza. Thank you, Ines. And she says, well, very interesting presentation. I'd like to know the author's opinions on what is the best option for effort management, or what is more important in general, to go forth and implement new marine protected areas, or to allocate efforts to properly implement and manage existing MPAs. So obviously it's a pressing question regarding all the efforts being made in the 30 by 30 objective and so on. So quite a pressing question, I would say. Any thoughts?
I can start. Of course, that both are important, but I see very, very important to implement the existing MPAs, as new MPAs are hard to establish. but not at the expense of creating new MPAs. So I think both can go in parallel, and they need to but raising and highlighting that they need to be implemented, not lines only in lines in the map. And I'm sure that my colleagues have something to add.
I agree. Yeah, that's it.
Agreed. And especially thinking of climate resilience and networks, that's something that I've been thinking about in the US context, making sure that they're not just lines on the map, that they actually are affording the protection that we want them to, so they're at the right level. And then maybe that's a combination of, both, and a combination of improving the ones that exist, but maybe adding new ones in areas that we know are really important, especially as climate is changing. Thanks, Barbara.
It's a difficult balance, but we reached consensus here. Cool. So we have another question from Katerina, which I think that Jenna touched upon a bit earlier, but I think if you want to elaborate a bit more, you can. So the question is, decision tree seems to be a very pragmatic and objective approach to the impacts. How do you balance this with the socioeconomic aspects of the MPAs? That's what you were saying a bit earlier, no, Jenna?
Yeah, and I'll let anyone else weigh in here too. That's certainly very, very relevant, especially to the enabling conditions of thinking, how can MPAs work for people and nature, and both of those things simultaneously, since people rely on healthy nature, both for for social reasons and cultural reasons, but also economic reasons. And yeah, I think thinking through the benefits of fully protected, highly protected, and also lightly protected areas for economic reasons, fisheries benefits, tourism benefits, all of those things, and financing, which comes in for a stage of establishment, really having people behind an MPA and having it well financed and staffed and things like that. We know those are really important for having effectiveness. Maybe I'll stop there and see if anybody has anything to add, but yeah, certainly a really important piece. If it's not working for people, then nobody's gonna actually, the MPA will fail if people don't support it in the local communities. And a lot of that has to do with livelihoods. And that's why I'm so excited that social and ecological scientists and, knowledge holders, Indigenous groups, all of that input into how we can best use the MPA guide and make it useful for designating new MPAs and also improving the ones that exist. So,
anyone else wants to chip in on this? Okay.
In that case,
yeah,
we'll go to the next question where, we still have a couple, and I'll let you manage your time. But the next one is from Sofia Vicente. So she says, hi, everyone. In Dr. Kirsten's presentation, she briefly talked about political commitment. Would love to hear everyone's opinion. Maybe there are differences in Portugal and the US about how to ensure that commitment over time with how to ensure that commitment can be made over time with different governments. She says, hard question, I know. And yeah, I could just compliment saying that there's a very similar, there's a recent case in the US about President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, for example. So this is quite a similar topic, yeah.
Yes, very. I'm happy it went here because we need to have these conversations. Yes, certainly where we sit in the US has been a long road over the past years. Of course, with the rollbacks of a lot of national monuments, which are protected areas here in the States that were then and are in the process of being reinstated with the new administration. I think, this is something that we will continue to have to tackle. I do think that this is a great example of why we need the governance structure, at the national level, but we also need community leadership and community investment and to highlight what's needed. And I say that because, it's really easy for politicians and policymakers to come in and out and not be directly affected by a lot of these decisions, but the communities themselves are the ones that are dealing with the aftermath and trying to manage their resources and conserve their spaces. So for example, here in Oregon, we have a community that's down south that's really engaged, a community of active fishing community, a small community that essentially proposed their own MPA and then worked over the last decade to have it established and to monitor and adaptively manage it, and that's ongoing. So we've had a number of different governors in the meantime with different agendas, but that community keeping the thread and advocating for that over time really has resulted in its long term. So not easy, but I think we need both.
Not easy for sure. So we just have 2 more questions, and I think it's good because we all have to leave in 20 minutes. So it's okay. If anyone has a last question, please do type it. Otherwise, we will finish with these 2. And the next question is from Milika. He, I don't know, says, thanks for the great talks. Will you try to reach out to the managers outside of Portugal too and discuss the guide and ways to improve management? If so, in what places in particular? Thank you. You can see that we have a lot of questions about policy and about engaging with stakeholders, and I think that says a lot about our audience and about the type of concerns that we have and that the audience has, and I think this is a good place to discuss this. So will you try to reach out managers outside Portugal too?
I could say really brief.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes. So we've designed this to be a global tool from the beginning, and Barbara's done Barbara and Emmanuel Gonçalves have done such great work in Portugal, and it's a really an early case study. We have a couple other examples of those where there's been an assessment of MPAs in Indonesia that's been done by WWF Indonesia in collaboration with some, the relevant ministries there. Also, Canada has CPAWS is an organization in Canada that has been assessing their MPAs, and their report will come out soon. Here in the US, we're trying to engage with this decision makers since we now have a national commitment to 30 by 30 through Biden's executive order. So really hoping the guide can be useful there and thinking through what will count towards that 30% and how to improve US MPAs to better deliver the outcomes that we need. And then there's work ongoing. We have the co-authors on the MPA guide paper represent all 6 habitable continents. So we have a really wide geographic spread. So different co-authors and different people who are familiar with the guide in their contexts are starting to do some of these assessments too across the world.
And I would just add too that these types of conversations are so great and really helpful for us, but also to hear from you. So for example, we have one scenario where we're working with an MPA in Panama who we gave a webinar like this, and the manager reached out and said, we're about to update our management plan. We have a lot of questions about whether or not we've got everything that we need there and whether we are, have everything in place to reach our outcomes. So can we have a conversation guided by the guide? And that's been excellent. So we just encourage everyone to reach out for conversation if that's something that would be useful, because we really hope that it can work at that level as well, at the very community single MPA level.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I think we're going for the last, well,
just to create a new one. Okay.
Yeah, previous to last, because now we have 2.
This is the last one. Yeah.
So let's go to the previous to last from Sophia Enriques. Thank you, Sophia. She says, congratulations for this work. For sure, it will be a very useful tool to improve MPA effectiveness. To improve the current status of MPAs, at least in Portugal, we have to convince governments to give money for monitoring plans and enforcement in a consistent way. Which are the best approaches to do that, in your opinion? So loaded question here, but I'm sure you can take care of it.
I don't know who wants to start. This is a hard question.
I think you, Barbara, you go.
Yeah. I think all of us, and I know Sophia, all of us need to reach out governments and decision makers and try to push, and also the general public as this movement that is being conducted to the climate action. I think we should also have more into the ocean protection. There are some international movements, but even at the local scale, as Kirsten was also mentioning in the Oregon. So money exists, and there are some money in this for conservation. How this money is used is a different story. So even if in Portugal we don't have that much money, we have some, and we have European funds, and we have a lot of projects. So we should have a better management of that of those funds to make this something that is mandatory to implement. We cannot have MPAs that are only designated, for example.
And if I could just add just something, how can technology help this in the sense of making these investments lower, let's say, to monitor larger areas with lesser costs? Because this might be a key issue in the future, because the excuse, let's say, is always the same. We don't have enough money, we don't have enough human resources, etc. So can technology really help us to get where we need to be in 9 years, let's say?
Yeah, I think it will be a very good contribution, both for monitoring and for enforcement, because there is not even monitoring, there are new technology to use with less resources, and enforcement as well, not only in those large offshore MPAs. We can use that technology in coastal MPAs as well, with different adaptations of the technology. So for sure, that will have a role.
Yeah, I agree, especially as our resolution gets higher with things like Global Fishing Watch. It's an incredible service. The other thing that I was going to say is on the investments piece too, when thinking about the climate crisis and our, global movement to do better. Jen and I have a friend and colleague who likes to say, MPAs are like solving $1 billion question with $1,000 science. These areas, MPAs are in terms of the different options, relatively cost effective. And those things are an investment for sure. But when you think about the returns, for example, on climate mitigation, opportunity for adaptation for these species and habitats that we rely on, it's actually a pretty good investment. So that's a nice vignette to use. But also, when we start thinking about nationally determined contributions and all these things towards climate mitigation, MPAs are right there in the mix.
Yeah, and it's also up to us to demand more transparent and hold the civil servants accountable for the ways they spend these types of funds, or even if they to ask them to worry really about this question. And what you were saying about these climate movements, I think that this is going to be probably MPAs and protected areas in general are going to be probably one of the next things that we are going to rise up for. So this is really our last question. We are not accepting any more questions now, and it's from Rico. It says, thanks for the presentations and a great paper. Your work is very timely and useful. I think we all agree with that. The MPA guide is mainly on evaluating individual MPAs, if I'm not mistaken, but how would you see this framework in perspective of evaluation of MPA networks? Anyone?
I think Kirsten is the best now.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I think it plays out in two ways. The first is when we talk about enabling conditions, actually, and effective ecological design principles, connectivity. So, kind of the backbone of what we mean by networks is part of that, that MPAs should be designed for connectivity and of sufficient size and spacing. So I think it plays in there. The other place it plays into is on the active management side. And, so the guide obviously provides a number of different questions you can ask, and for the stages of establishment, ways you can evaluate whether a site is actively managed or not. There are also different complementary tools that are out there that we designed the guide to work together with. One is the IUCN Green List, and one is Marine Conservation Institute's Blue Parks program. And so both of those go even much deeper into what active management is. Like Barbara said, we have expanded guidance, and I think it's like 40 pages, right? So we have a fair amount of guidance on that, but really being able to track all those different aspects, including network connectivity, we often point to those programs as well to say, look here, and there's some other great expanded guidance from there.
And if I may add, you can have the matrix, the matrix can be applied at the network level, and you understand if your network is mostly made of highly or lightly, or so you can give those numbers and those percent covers to each of these protection levels and stages of establishment. So you have a better knowledge of your network as well.
Okay, I think we have finished in great time. Thank you once again. I don't know if you want to add any closing remarks, or maybe Kirsten or Jenna. Bárbara, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you so much for having us. This has been great questions too.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to present us your paper. And I'm sure that this will lead to many interesting conversations. I would like to thank you once again. Thank you everyone in the audience that made really good questions and a lot of food for thought here. Thank you once again. Have a nice day, Kirsten and Jenna, and have a nice evening, the rest of the people. And we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this initiative and for having us.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.